sick, we can take some of your blood and we can find out if your kidney will go in my body or if your liver will be transferred in my body. We can do all different types of testing to find out whether there is a compatibility because of Dr. Thomas Cone. Well, let's go a little bit further. The paradigm shift that goes with Dr. Thomas Cone was also introduced because now we can find out who really did it. Tell your neighbor, now we can find out who really committed the crime. Because of Dr. Cone now, we can find out, amen, what type of trace elements have been left behind in order to put the right person in the place of responsibility for what they have done. Because of Dr. Cone, there were people that were in jail that got released because of DNA evidence. There were people that had been wrongfully accused, but because now there has been a paradigm shift, those that were initially false accused now had to be released because there was evidence that would tie somebody else to the crime. Look around and tell your neighbor, work, 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 Bishop. And so we find here that because of Dr. Cone, there has been a shift in all of humanity. We're finding now that people, amen, are able to do things like create designer babies. I know some of you may not be familiar, but some of you may be. Now they're able to take the egg and the sperm and do what's called spermatic washing and any type of element that would be there that could cause that child to have, amen, blood pressure problems or what we call sugar problems. Now they can eliminate those traits that will manifest later, and all of this is because of one person presenting the power of DNA. Look around and tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, we're going somewhere. And not only, amen, if we can just go back a little bit further, when there was another man that created a paradigm shift when the Reformation of the Protestant church was birthed. Even now, we find that there was a man that made up in his mind that he could no longer deal with the tyranny that was going on in the Catholic Church. Some of you today don't even really know that being a Protestant came from being one that protests. That's why most of the time people in the church, you can't satisfy them because before you can get it in their mouth, out of your mouth, they already protesting because they're Protestant. Sometimes you just got to look at somebody and say, oh baby, I know you don't mean no harm. This is just what you came out of with your Protestant self. But we must understand that the one person that changed the very course of history and the course of the future, because when you change history, you change the future. You can't change one, amen, without changing the other. And so Martin Luther knocked on the door of the Catholic Church and stamped a letter on the Catholic Church, which told the Catholic Church that we're no longer going to put up with your unnecessary enslavement that you are placing on the people. No longer are we going to allow you to make us give this and make us do that and make us do that. And out of Martin Luther, you have two Protestant Reformations that were birthed. You have Calvinism and you have the Lutherans. Come on, somebody. But look around and tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, I need that paradigm shift. And so, in other words, I want to tell you the power of one individual to be able to change the impact that happens happens on humanity. Now, if you will allow me to go back just a little bit further, if we can now deal with the basis of our text. When we look at this text, we find now that Jesus is introducing them to something that they never experienced before. There were times when they had Holy Communion before, but in the Old Testament it was indicative of celebrating the Passover. In other words, it celebrated them coming out of Egypt, walking through the wilderness, and coming into the place of promise. But we have here now that Jesus is taking something that they've always done and calling them to look at it in a different way. Look around and tell your neighbor, paradigm shift. In the past, Elder Hill, they looked at this as something that was symbolic, something that celebrated what they already done, celebrated the victory that they already had. But Jesus said, now, I want to shift your mentality, because what you've been looking at as a place of historic celebration is now bringing you into a place of commemoration. He says, now in the past you did this, amen, because of your release of Egypt. But now I want to teach you how to do what you're doing in remembrance of me. In other words, I'm going to take what you used to celebrate and now put you in a position where I become the very thing that you are celebrating. In other words, before you had a great holiday and you were celebrating this, but now I'm getting ready to tell you that that blood or that wine or that which you are drinking that has in the past, amen, been symbolic of the blood of the calves and wolves that were applied, calves and sheep that were applied. Now I'm getting ready to show you that what you're eating and what you're drinking is me. In other words, it's kind of very similar to perceptual ambiguity. Perceptual ambiguity is the branch of psychology that deals with people's perception. Have you ever seen the picture where someone will present you with a duck, and when you look at that duck long enough, you look at it long enough, it turns into something else? Or have you ever seen the picture where someone would present to you and initially it looked like a witch, but if you flip that thing over, it looks like a young woman? How many of you have ever seen those types of pictures? Well, look at your neighbor really quickly and say, neighbor, God's getting ready to take what you've been looking at, go get the musicians, a long time, and he's going to change your perception of what you are looking at. Look around and tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, I know you've been looking at the same thing a long time, but God's about to take the very same thing that you've been looking at and change your perception. In other words, if he don't change my situation, he's going to change my perception. Because in all actuality, is it really me that needs to change or my situation? Pat yourself and say, it is my situation. I wish I had time to preach in here today. But what I need you to understand very simply is this, that now we have Jesus taking what they celebrated historically in the past, and now he's taking that very thing and he's saying to them, now I am the shed blood and I am the broken body. But the powerful thing about this shift is now no longer are they celebrating Passover, but they're celebrating the death, burial, and the resurrection. Have I got anybody in here that understands what Jesus was doing there? He was showing them that the Judaizers and the Pharisees have a historical perception of the Bible, but now I'm about to be the life of which you are reading. Look around and tell somebody God's about to bring some stuff to life in your perception. I know when you looked at it one time, it looked one way, but look around and tell somebody, don't stop looking, because God is going to change your perception. I wish somebody would lift your hand now and say, paradigm shift. Yeah. So now when we look at this, we find here that Jesus has given them a very simple task. He's telling them, Peter, I know you were a fisherman in the past, but now I'm about to change your profession, because I'm about to change your occupation. I wish I had somebody that would lift your hand now and say, I got to get my language together, because God's changing my profession. He's changing my perception. Lift your hand now and say, God, I just want to thank you for shifting me into the etymology or the makeup of who you really ordained me to be. Have I got anybody in here now that's going to be like the disciples when Jesus told them to come off the boat? Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, he told them all to come off the boat, but there was only one that stepped out of the boat. His name was Peter. How many of you know that when God calls you into a paradigm shift, you're going to have some boat people that refuse to step out with you? But have I got anybody in here that will look around and tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, I really don't know who you are, but I just want to know that when God calls our name, that you don't mind stepping out with me. Look at somebody and tell them, I need you to come off the boat, because in this paradigm shift, God's going to manifest things that nobody's ever seen before. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, in this shift, people going to see what they never saw. They going to do what they never done. They going to be what they never been. Look around and say, yeah. Trying to decide how deep with this I want to go. I'm going to stop right there. I'm not going to mess with you theologically anymore. And so here, with this paradigm shift, in other words, if you will allow me to give you a paraphrase of what paradigm shift means, is it means that you were looking at things one way, and then when something else was presented, it caused you to shift your perception of what you were looking at. I wish somebody would lay your hands on your eyes now and say, God, anoint me to see this thing the way you would have me to. Look around and say, neighbor, I know you thought that was a duck, but flip that picture and it ain't gonna say quack quack, but that thing's about to look like an eagle. I need you to get your eyes anointed to see the parrot shift. Where somebody will lift your hand and say, Lord, I need a paradigm shift. There's some of you right now that are still, if you will allow me, just give me 5 more minutes. I get really excited about theology. Tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, what you've got to understand is with a paradigm shift comes a different mentality, comes a different pulchritude, comes a different stance. With a paradigm shift, you don't just know that you're a conqueror, but you know you're more than a conqueror. Come. Somebody lift your hand and say, I'm more than. Tell them, keep watching me. I might look like a duck right now, but keep watching me.